Well, thank you so much, Congressman Wittman, for
Thank you.
joining. I'm Nick Kazvini-Gore, Head of Government Affairs at Applied Intuition. It's my real honor to welcome Congressman Wittman here to Nexus 23. Congressman Wittman is honored to represent Virginia's 1st Congressional District, a senior member of the House Armed Services Committee, chairman of the important Tactical Air and Land Forces Subcommittee, and also a member of the China Select Committee. We appreciate you being here. We understand there's votes. You've got a China Select hearing later this evening, so we recommend folks to tune into that as well. You've been a champion for defense innovation. We just heard from the previous panel how important Congress is and how really the authorizers have had their foot to the gas pedal. Just to frame the conversation, I wanted to throw out a statistic. We know that in 2021, DOD AI investment was at around $1.8 billion, compared to in 2022, commercial investment of $48 billion. So we understand that Congress understands the importance of tapping into commercial investment to feel that capability to the warfighter. We'll have a couple questions for me, and then we'll turn over to audience Q&A. I really urge the audience members to submit any questions that they have. So with that, the first question, sir, you've really been an ambassador between the DOD and Silicon Valley. You've made several trips to the Valley. We were honored to host you last year, and even take you for a ride in an autonomous truck with our partners, Kodiak Robotics, in the audience. You also penned an op-ed that we need to restore the Defense Valley. A lot of people forget that it was actually NASA and DOD dollars that put the Valley on the map. So how do you assess the current state of relations between DOD? What's the progress we've made, and what's the way forward?
Well, I think things are back on track to where they needed to be. What we saw previous was that DIU was now taken down a notch within the Pentagon, which didn't bode well for the priority that DOD should hold for Silicon Valley, for startups, for emerging technologies. The good news is, based upon our push and our leadership, the DOD now has elevated DIU back under the Secretary of Defense, which tells me that they are back to where they should be in prioritizing how technology companies, how investors, venture capitalists, private equity firms are focusing on how do we make sure we resource the development of this technology. There is a great opportunity here, and you hit the nail on the head about where the investment's taking place today. If you look at it, the predominance of investment is taking place in the private sector. So how do we leverage that investment? How do we make sure, too, that we are following the lead of what's happening in the development of these technologies? How do we look where there's dual-purpose technologies, but how do we look at technologies, too, that have a direct application within the DoD realm? If we are going to be successful, and we will, in competing with the Chinese, it will be based upon emerging technologies, our startups, and how we leverage capital that is looking to get into this space. How do we do that at the speed of relevance? Because I argue that the Chinese make a number of really big bets, and when they hit it big, but when they miss big. The advantage of our system is this, is that we have the ability amongst a lot of different technology spaces to make thousands of bets, and to make those bets quickly and determine, are they successful or are they not, and really be able to move forward what we can do in the realm of having an impact in this effort to overcome this strategic adversary, to do that at the speed of relevance. That, to me, is the most important part of this, and that's the value that Silicon Valley brings to the table, that venture capitalists bring to the table, that private equity brings to the table, because they can do things much faster than the Pentagon ever could. And listen, I understand there are a lot of people in the Pentagon that want to do the right thing. It is such a big organization that it has a hard time working at the speed of relevance. The way we are able to get to where we need to be at the speed of relevance is utilizing emerging technologies, startups, and the capital, both venture capital and private equity, that's out there today.
Yeah, that's a very important comment you made also about DIU. As you know, it was originally a direct report and then moved to R&E, and you championed the efforts with your colleagues to restore it back as a direct report to the Secretary of Defense. There was a new director that was just sworn in last week.
Yes.
So I'm curious, as you think tactically and operationally, like it's 6 months, like how do we measure the success, the renewed effort with DIU? Michelle Flournoy said earlier, like she thinks that we need to make sure that DIU is moving prototyping to production. So I'd be interested in your reactions there.
Well, I think one of the biggest things that DIU can do is to pick up on its past successes about identifying companies that have technologies that have direct application, making sure too that they stay on the same track of success of graduating those companies into the sphere of actually having operational systems in the hands of our warfighters. So as we know under CBR, you have phase 1 and phase 2. A lot of great work goes on there. The most important thing that happens is determining what are the most promising technologies and then making sure that we get those to scale. Make sure we get those to a phase 3 company. Make sure that those are actually operational aspects of that technology that can be in the hands of the warfighter, and do that, as I said, at the speed of relevance. The whole issue with this is being able to develop both capacity and capability in almost real time. That's something that is not within the Pentagon's sphere of strengths, but it's in the sphere of strength of what the DIU can do within that realm. There's also other things that are happening that I think can be complementary to that. We need to look at all of these things and make sure, too, that we are properly resourcing DIU. It's great to get out there and identify these companies, but if we're not resourcing them in a way that they can actually get to scale, that's of issue. We want to make sure, too, that we are using all the different tools that have been placed out there, like OTAs, other transaction authorities, MTAs, to make sure that these companies are graduating. We need to use every tool in the toolbox. DIU has shown that they can do this effectively. Now that they're back in the place that they need to be, I am excited about what they'll be able to do.
Thank you. Yeah, you mentioned the really critical authorities that your committee has provided the Department of Defense, the Agile Acquisition Framework, OTA, MTA, Software Pathway. I know there's several companies in the room that have benefited from that, scaling that technology. Of course, the appropriators, on the other hand, have sometimes expressed concern with the increased flexibilities that come to the programs of record. There's a history, of course, of mistrust. So there's sort of a tension, I think, for congressional observers between the authorizers and the appropriators. I think that we've seen progress in the past couple of months. There was language in the explanatory statement for the fiscal year 23 appropriations bill where the appropriators are trying to rein in the OTA and budget activity 08, which is a mechanism that you can do software pathway using RDT&E dollars. So I'd be interested in your thoughts, your communications with the appropriators, where you see they are, and I wanted to thank you for your committee's work to really champion those efforts.
Well, I think it's incredibly important for authorizers to talk to appropriators because we need to be on the same page and we can't be at cross purposes with each other. If we're going to authorize something, it needs to be funded. Those are keys. We've had great conversations with myself, with Chairman Rogers, with Chairman Calvert, who is the chairman of the House Appropriations Subcommittee on Defense, about what we need to do going forward. We want to make sure we're properly resourcing DIU. We want to make sure that we also enable DIU through OTAs and MTAs. I think that they are incredibly important tools that they need to have. I do think that the appropriators want that to be there. Like anything else, they want to have that control, but they need to be able to let go a little bit too. Chairman Calvert has been great in putting forth a new program called AppFit, where they were able to set aside $100 million and said, listen, let's use that to scale companies, those that can't cross the valley of death, that find it difficult to do that. How do we make sure we properly resource that so they can get to a phase 3, so they can actually scale this technology? Last year, I think, was a good first step. The only challenge that I saw with it is it was $100 million, and the language said they could fund up to 10. And in typical fashion, it was $100 million cut 10 ways, instead of the metric being how do we how do we resource at scale to make sure that there is a successful transition there? I think you'll find that there'll be some changes this year, hopefully a higher dollar amount, but also more flexibility, so it's not taking the pie and cutting it 10 ways, but the metric is how do we truly make the decision of financing and resourcing to where these companies can truly get to scale. And I think Chairman Calvert gets it. He and I have had conversations about, how do we really push the issue? How do we create tools that the private sector can do even more? And also, how do we make sure the private sector gets the clear demand signal from the customer, which is DOD? That's also going to direct investment. So all those conversations have taken place. They've been really productive conversations. And I can say, at least in my experience, I think that we on the authorization side are more aligned with the appropriators than we have ever been since I've been in Congress.
Thank you. You mentioned authorization, appropriations. We want to commend you and applaud you for your recent introduction of HR 3168, or the Autonomous Systems Adoption and Policy Act, colloquially known as the ASAP Act, given the need to adopt the technology quickly. For this critical piece of legislation would authorize the creation of the Joint Autonomy Office within the CDAO, the OSD, really to house the T&E infrastructure for all programs of record. So I want to thank you again for introducing that. It's bipartisan. The prospects of that, if you think we can enact it and fund it this year, and the way forward.
Sure. Well, listen, I'm very excited about the Autonomous System Adoption and Policy Act. It is, I think, an incredibly important next step in the process. We've seen in the Pentagon where there has been a movement towards autonomy at a faster pace than has happened in the past. But as is, again, part of the element of any large organization and bureaucracy, it's still very fragmented. If we're going to have unity of purpose, it needs to be in a single place. It needs to be resourced from a single perspective. That is, appropriators and authorizers need to say, this is the pot of resources we're going to put together for autonomy. This bill allows that to happen. It also creates a direction for the Pentagon to say, let's assure that we are applying autonomy in the proper ways. We want to make sure that the technology that's out there is not just being applied in a spot treatment way. We want to make sure it's put out there across the board. Autonomy holds great promise in many different systems, and we don't want it to be limited by how one service branch sees autonomy. We want to make sure that it's looked at from a broad perspective and say, well, why aren't we looking at autonomy for this, rather than saying, well, this one service branch is looking at autonomy in this particular realm. So this opens up the aperture for autonomy to really have a much broader application within DOD. It also assures that the questions that need to be asked about where technology is going are asked up front so that DOD can get in front of where the technology is going. Because many times DOD just follows it, and many times it's years behind where the technology is going. This office will be in the situation to ask the question, where's the technology going? How do we make sure that the technology is directing where DOD goes? And to make sure, too, that DOD is within that realm asking the right questions of industry, saying, well, with what you have at your avail, can your application of technology do these things? Can it be used within this realm? That informs then DOD on what it needs to do in its request to Congress. It also informs the industry about where's the demand going to be? What's the customer going to expect from the industry? Where's the technology going? I think all those things will be now possibilities that before were sort of an afterthought in where DOD was going.
Of all the different use cases for autonomy, there's CASEVAC, there's intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. There's so many ways it could revolutionize and make the life of the warfighter easier and more effective, and all the rest. I'm curious, sir, given your championing of this critical technology, what use case excites you the most?
Well, listen, I think the instances that you mentioned, intelligence, surveillance, being able to leverage that massive amount of information quickly with autonomy is incredibly important. I think, though, the most promising aspect of what we have in our windshield is CCA, the Collaborative Combat Aircraft, which I think has a lot of applications across every element of aviation within all the service branches. It is the game changer in what we can do to counter what the Chinese are doing with their fifth generation aircraft, with the ability that they bring to the table, also with what they can do too to hold our manned air assets at risk at distance. What we're able to do with that is incredible. Some of the information that we've gone through with the Air Force and the Navy and some of the very classified programs in NGAD, which is Next Generation Air Dominance, is the game changer. The collaborative combat aircraft, I think, will be the game changer, what we can do, even today with current platforms and what we can do there. And I want to stress that these aircraft will be semi-autonomous, but the things that they're able to do are game changers. They will allow our manned aircraft to do orders of magnitude more than what they could do with a single pilot behind the stick. So I want folks to understand that. I want to understand, too, that they are force multipliers, that these aircraft will operate in concert with manned aircraft, and they will act in concert with how we plan to meet these challenges, how we mission plan. All those things are going to be incredibly important. You know, they are not going to operate in an autonomous realm, so they're not going to be carrying weapons and kind of be out there on their own. But the good news about the collaborative combat aircraft is they can do a number of different missions. They can do intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. They can be an extended eyes and ears, an extended aperture for manned aircraft. They can also do electronic warfare. So when our aircraft have to fly into areas where they are at risk, these platforms can do a lot to be able to mitigate that risk. They can also carry weapons. So when our platforms are, as the term goes, Winchester, when they're out of weapons, guess what? Now you have other platforms that are there to be able to do that. And then the manned platform can operate at distance. So it can do target acquisition, it can do battle management, and then you have out there your electronic warfare platform, your intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. You have a weapons platform out there. This is a game changer in the ways that I think is only limited by our imagination. I am very excited about that. We're going to be doing a lot of things in this year's NDAA to really enable CCA, to move CCA to the left, because we have to get it into the hands of the warfighter as quickly as we can.
How do you assess the health of that program? Obviously, we support it fully.
Yeah.
Do you believe that critical program is adopting commercial technologies? I believe also Secretary Kendall mentioned that the CCA would cost, I think, around 20 million per unit. So definitely much less than other platforms, but not quite, some of the attritable, like the drones you're seeing in Ukraine. Yeah.
Listen, there's a big span of where the cost aperture is for these aircraft. It can be in the single-digit millions up to the upper end, as Secretary Kendall has said. What we're seeing is that there's a lot of off-the-shelf technology that can be applied to these platforms. There are dozens of companies that already have these platforms that they've developed that would be ready to go tomorrow. So it's not like you have to go and come up with a set of requirements and then go out there and set these requirements out there for the industry that then design and develop to, and then move that from requirements to program of record. Those platforms are already out there. So this is something that could literally tomorrow somebody press the button and say, listen, we're going to do A, B, C, and D. We're going to do it within this aperture of cost. We're going to do it in this aperture of performance, and literally get this going tomorrow. That's why it's so important for us to make sure we get this underway. We're going to have to look at how we resource that. I can tell you there'll be a lot of attention this year on how we resource that. Secretary Kendall has said he sees this as an incredibly important part of that. He talked about having 1,000+ platforms in the short term. I think that this is indeed the game changer. I think the Air Force gets it. I think the Navy gets it. And for that matter, even the other service branches, I think the Army and Marine Corps get it. They are all pursuing their own tracks on these collaborative combat aircraft. And I think it holds the most promise for us to a largest measure possible to make the risk calculus for the Chinese Communist Party more difficult than it's ever been. And that's what we need to do. If we're going to be effective in deterring and effective if we find ourselves in conflict, we have to make sure the risk calculus for the Chinese is as complex as it can be, that the uncertainty is driven to an unacceptable level so that every morning when Xi Jinping wakes up, he says this, he says, no, not today. And that's what I think this platform can do.
Thank you, sir. As I mentioned before, you serve on the important China Select Committee.
Yes.
I want to pull from an audience question that relates to this.
Sure.
The Department of Justice charged an Apple engineer with 6 counts of theft after he stole code from Apple's autonomous technology for a company linked with the Chinese Communist Party. As we know, IP theft from the US is not new. It's not just China, it's other countries as well. It's a major concern for Congress. So what can Congress do to ensure that these critical technologies are protected from this pacing threat and others, and to ensure that American innovation is protected?
I think we need to enhance our effort with companies that are doing business in critically important realms within the United States government, whether it's intelligence or defense. And I think what we need to do, too, is to realize that it's not just looking at first-order effects. It's not just looking at a company and saying, are there any sort of ties with this company to the CCP? What we're finding now, as companies are starting to do even more of their own due diligence, is we're finding now second and third order effects. So it's not just the company that this company that does business with the United States government is doing, but it's then a company that's doing business with a company that then is doing business with somebody that is connected to the United States government. So we need to be able to search these things out, and we need to also understand, too, that doing business with any company in China is a probable link to the CCP. So let's call it for what it is. There is, in some way, shape, or form, an effort by the CCP to have an influence on every company that operates in China. As far as IP, we know what the Chinese require. They require that those companies hand over their IP to China. And we know what China does with that. China takes it, reverse engineers it, uses it to their advantage. We had an opportunity to go out and meet with Tim Cook at Apple, and Tim was very forthright about how they see Apple operating in China. They see what China is doing. Their main competitor in China is Huawei. And if you look at a Huawei phone and you look at an iPhone, you see there's an incredible amount of similarity there. The difference is in the privacy controls that Apple has. Apple is making essentially a decision to say, listen, we understand that our tenure in China is probably going to be short-lived, so look at what Apple's doing to reconfigure how it manufactures. It's making the move to India. So I think others are seeing the same sort of thing on what China requires in turning over IP. And in the long term, for most companies, that's not a good long-term strategy to have. And China will absolutely do everything it can to displace that company based upon the IP that they've handed over to the Chinese.
On that topic, the China Select Committee that the speaker stood up is charged, one of the pillars is looking at technology, innovation. It's our understanding that the speaker and the leader came together and said, show me the initiatives that you have from this committee and we will work to enact that. I'm curious, focusing on technology, what are some of the initiatives you think will come out of the China Select Committee focused on technology, innovation? Thank you.
Well, I know that one of the hearings we're going to have today begin to go down the path of what are the economic impacts of what China is doing within the world economy. We focused on more of the strategic challenges from China in the previous hearings. Today we'll begin down that path. Our effort as a committee is to come up with proposed legislation. One of the tenets is what we call 10 for Taiwan. So 10 elements of policy, hopefully culminating in legislation that will address the challenges that we have from Taiwan. Remember, the Select Committee does not have legislating powers, but it does have the power to hold hearings, to do discovery, to put that information together, to draft legislation and get that to committees of jurisdiction. And that's what our path is now. So we're beginning the effort of developing those policy recommendations in the form of legislation, getting them to committees of jurisdiction like the Armed Services Committee, Natural Resources Committee on things like critical minerals and rare earth elements. So we're beginning to go down that track. I'm excited about some of the policy recommendations that will come out of the committee. I think they can be game-changing, and it's good that the leadership from both sides of the aisle have given the impetus to not just the Select Committee, but also to committees of jurisdiction to say, we expect that this committee will result in substantive changes in U.S. law through legislation that will have an impact on this strategic adversary we find ourselves faced with in the Chinese Communist Party.
And it's very refreshing to see how bipartisan the committee is.
Yeah.
You had the inaugural hearing a couple weeks ago. Just everyone was sort of speaking from the same sheet of music.
Yes.
Do you see that? Of course, you've got other fractures within Congress, the debt ceiling, appropriations. Do you see the China committee continuing to be a source of bipartisanship in Congress?
I do. You know, I'm really honored to serve in two of what I think are the most bipartisan committees on the Hill. The Select Committee on China, incredibly bipartisan. I think people have a very similar viewpoint about the threat that China poses to the United States, the Chinese Communist Party poses to the United States, and the things that are in the scope of what we need to do to address that. The same with the Armed Services Committee. If you look at the things that we do, the National Defense Authorization Act, the single largest bill that comes out of Congress every year, sans the appropriations bill, every year comes out in a strongly bipartisan way. So I'm very honored to serve on two committees that I think are the most bipartisan in Congress. And I think they have to be. We have to have a common purpose and a common mindset on what we need to do to address this nation's challenges. And the good news is that, you know, we've been able to maintain that through, again, the leadership from both sides of the aisle, both on the Select Committee and on Armed Services Committee.
Thank you. I want to turn to another audience question. This one comes from Rob Bassett, CEO of Adarga AI. He was a former operator, and he agrees that these critical technologies like autonomy and others is very vital to get into the hands of the warfighter. But as a CEO of a software company, he knows that some of the critical enablers of AI are boring things, like low-hanging fruit, like can you send an email, infrastructure, architectures, data. I'd be curious, sir, what are your thoughts on getting commanders, policymakers to focus on some of the low-hanging fruit, like enterprise software at DOD?
Now, listen, I agree. Those are key enablers, and you have to be able to get these technologies and tools down to the operational level. And what I have in mind too this year in this year's NDAA is to make sure that folks that have these solutions should have access to the Pentagon through a windshield to say, hey, listen, I've got an application that I think would be great in the hands of soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen, these junior enlisted, because they're pretty resourceful. What I think needs to happen is there needs to be that window there, and companies out there that say, hey, I have an enabler, I have a technology, I have something that will make the job easier, will be an enhancer for that. They should be able to say, give me the window to get this in the hands of those junior enlisted. Let them try it out. Let them determine what utility this has. And then from that bottom up, the decision should be made to say, hey, if this is an enabler and we're being told that this helps, how do we make that happen? Because a lot of times it's from top down, and we understand that the warfighters out there are pretty intuitive about what they know works and what they can make work. We know, too, that there are a lot of times folks in the upper echelons that say, hey, we're going to do these things to make things happen. But what happens is the middle in the Pentagon, that frozen middle just says, sorry, yeah, Wittman, I was here before you got there, and I'll be here after you got there. There's not a requirement for it. We're not doing it. You can talk all you want about it. So the question is how do we unfreeze that middle? I think transparency is a big way to do that. And I think, too, being able to highlight those things that are enablers for folks at that level, at the operational level, is the game changer. And I think that is able to put the pressures that can thaw out that frozen middle. And again, making sure, too, that they have the tools. So things like OTAs and MTAs to say, listen, we don't have to wait years to write a requirement. You know, we can do the things that immediately will enable decisions to be made to get these tools into the hands of folks that, if they could use these things tomorrow, would be game changers.
We've reached the end of our time, Congressman. Thank you so much for joining. We covered DIU, appropriations, authorization, and really look forward to watching these bills develop in the NDAA. And you let us know how we can be helpful as we move the ball forward for the warfighter.
Absolutely. Well, listen, I want to thank Applied Intuition. I want to thank the Atlantic Council. Thank everybody for being part of today. What an incredible opportunity to exchange thoughts and ideas. Thank you, too, for what you do to drive policy. Your attendance here today is what will drive policy, is what will make sure that we as decision makers do the right things, and what will also push the Pentagon to do the right thing and to make sure they're making the decisions in a timely and meaningful way. So Nick, thanks again. What a great opportunity.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.